What was the first series that really got you into reading? That moment when a light bulb went off in your head and you just went, oh wait, books are actually cool. It's such a fun party question because the answers you're going to get are all over the place. But there are a few series that almost feel scientifically engineered to hook you in with adventures, puzzles, and shockingly dark moments just for good measure, and Deltora Quest is absolutely one of them. Now sure, this early 2000s series for younger readers wasn't some unstoppable juggernaut like Harry Potter, but it was still a huge deal, selling millions of copies and running way longer than you might think. In fact, you've probably walked past these books at some point in your life, and if you have, you definitely would have noticed them because the covers had this wild, unique aesthetic and these crazy looking monsters staring right back at you. And yet, in modern conversations, Deltora Quest barely gets mentioned, and dare I say, it's criminally underrated, which is a real shame because this series excels at what it sets out to do. Sure, it might not be a household name, but for a ton of people, it was foundational. So let's dive into what makes this series so good, what makes this series surprisingly dark, its unexpectedly long publication history, and finally speculate a bit on what the future might hold to explore whatever happened to Deltora Quest. Hi everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examined. In this channel, we'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and I want to give an enormous shout out to my patrons who keep this channel alive. You guys rock. Okay, so explaining Deltora Quest at surface level is easy. It is plain, simple, straight up adventure. Unapologetic, borderline stubborn in its commitment to just being pure, unfiltered adventure. The moment you pick up one of these 2000-era children fantasy books written by Emily Rodda with its gilded edges and covers featuring terrifying but somewhat goofy monsters, and you just know what you're getting into. And honestly, there's a lot of comfort in that. But it's also way more than that because this series has some bite. There is surprising death, actual humanity, and genuinely and straight up terrifying and dark moments for a children's series. Now, as far as clear, snappy fantasy premises that you can easily wrap your head around, Deltora is it, at first glance anyway. So here's what we got. Deltora is made up of 7 tribes, each with a sacred gemstone. Now, once upon a time, there was a terrifying, pure evil being called the Edgelord. Wait, sorry, got my notes mixed up here. I'm sorry, the Shadow Lord came along and decided to immediately set about renovating an area and to use all of his power to come up with the perfect, most interesting subversive name for it, the Shadowlands. After presumably taking a hot bath and a cup of tea, he sent out his monstrous horde to conquer Deltora. And at the darkest hour, a legendary blacksmith named Aiden came along, united the tribes, and convinced them to give their gemstones to forge the Belt of Deltora. When warned by a true ruler, the belt had enough power to push the Shadow Lord and his forces back into the Shadowlands. But you know where this is going, because after years of peace, the Shadow Lord made his inevitable comeback, took over Deltora again through the age-old method of evil advisors, and scattered the gemstones across the lands, each one now guarded by an absolutely terrifying monster. Now, this brings us to the present day and cue our heroes, Leaf, Barda, and Jasmine, with a mission to travel across the now ruined kingdom, recover the lost gemstones, and restore the Belt of Deltora to drive the Shadow Lord out once and for all. Snappy, right? But honestly, I think the real heart of the story isn't just the quest, it's the characters. A huge part of the charm comes from how they play off each other, and the fact that they're basically just normal people with zero superpowers really amps this up. Their dynamic isn't some perfect, unwavering friendship, it's messy, complicated, and real. One minute they're ready to leave, the next they miss each other, and you get the feeling that they're basically just sick of each other's but simultaneously they got each other's back in a second. So who makes up the gang? Well, first of all, we got Leaf, who at first glance seems like your standard fantasy protagonist. He's young, a little reckless, and determined to see his quest through. But what makes him interesting is how he deals with the weight of his journey. He's anxious constantly, which is honestly very relatable. But his superpower, if you will, is his rationality, calming down, working through the fears, and thinking things through logically. There's even a theory that the entire series is basically a metaphor for anxiety, and honestly, it does kind of track. Now, on the flip side, we got Rodda, the gruff, seen-it-all warrior of the group, and you can really feel his exasperation when Leaf does something dumb, and you can understandably just see him sigh as he goes about babysitting these teenagers on a death quest. But underneath all of that, he is fiercely loyal and way more emotionally intelligent than he lets on. And then there's Jasmine, raised in the forest, communicates with animals, has a pet bird and a pet whatever the this is. Classic feral child energy. But actually, I was surprised how deeply emotional she was, with a really strong sense of justice and vulnerability that she understandably doesn't want the others to see. And the dynamic between these three is the beating heart of the series. You see real growth, with Leaf maturing, Jasmine opening up, and Rodda slowly coming to trust his younger companions. And I was kind of surprised at how these characters, and even the side characters, are quite human, and not at all like 2D cutouts. Even someone like the Shadow Lord, who again seems very one-dimensional at the surface, is given a shockingly deep backstory. Speaking of surprises, one thing Deltora does really well is, well, surprises and twists. Now, I don't want to oversell it, but some of these books straight up pulled the wool over my eyes. On the reread for this video, I thought in my typical jaded adult fashion, wow, these stories are so predictable, I know exactly what's going to happen. But there were some things that I straight up did not see coming. The best part is that the twist and well-placed reveals, especially in the final stretch, aren't just thrown in for shock value. They really reframe everything you thought you knew. Now, on top of this, the world building here is again surprisingly fleshed out. Now, apparently Rodda took 2 years just thinking about the world of Deltora before she wrote a single word of the series, and instead of dumping a 900-page tome on us, she gave us a tight, concise fantasy series, which is really commendable and amazing that she was able to edit out and distill the primordial fantasy goo and give it to you in just these delicious tidbits. And a big part of these books is exploring the different regions of Deltora, and they all feel so distinct. Forest, labyrinths, monster-infested islands, and in totality the world feels massive, especially with hints of other lands and histories lurking just outside the main story, making it all feel really lived in, and also really dangerous because you can bet that Rodda does not pull punches. Because things get dark, like absurdly dark. It's even right there in the premise itself. This isn't your standard final battle between good and evil because the bad guys have already won. The kingdom is in ruins. People are barely scraping by. Sure, there are faint pockets of goodness left, but you get a sense that they're fading fast. And yes, it's technically not a super violent series, but then you remember the part where the heroes turn one of the villains into a tree, which is horrifying in its own way. There's also stuff like the horde of rats scene, which I am a firm believer that rats are actually very cute and intelligent animals, but too much of a good thing. But there's also more subtle, kind of disquieting things thrown in here, like in the very first book, and mild spoilers here, you find out that the entire outside world is an illusion. But more often than not, Rodda doesn't shove the horror in your face, but rather lets it sit there, kind of unsettling you in the background. But then, even in the foregrounds, there are just as terrifying things, because the monster design is absolute nightmare fuel. The Vral, the Akbaba, and the Guardians themselves are all grotesque or terrifying in their own way. But then there's also more of the nuanced terror in here as well, like with the Owls, which are basically these shape-shifting creatures that can take the form of almost anything, including humans. So it's basically like if the Animorphs were thrown in here too, but instead of being the good guys, they were the villains. But I think that's one of the reasons why this series is so good. The stakes are real. There's famine, destruction, and straight up death everywhere. And our heroes are by no means invincible and can and do get hurt. But I think a key distinction and another standout feature of the series is that against all these terrible monsters, our heroes don't win through confrontation or violence, but rather good old use of their noggin, or just going to the library. Puzzles and riddles constantly crop up everywhere, and it's no surprise that Rodda was apparently a huge fan of them, which is great on multiple levels because if you're anything like me, you'll try to sit down and figure them out, and the way Deltora weaves them in makes them feel like a real substantial part of the adventure rather than just random obstacles. They're challenging, fair, and probably a huge reason why the books are so memorable, especially because inside the books themselves, the riddles and coded messages are all presented in universe with these really endearing eye-catching graphics, which I think adds so much charm. And actually, the entire presentation, like the packaging itself, illustrated by Mark McBride, is really well thought out and very distinctly Deltora. And I'm willing to bet the cover art was a huge reason why a ton of kids picked these up in the first place, with these crazy monster designs and really nice details. Like with each book adding another gem to the belt of the spine to represent the heroes getting another gem. Now, as far as like major themes, again, there are some surprisingly adult and topical themes going on here, like the idea that rulers who don't understand their people are doomed to fail, and the classic one that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And of course, the classic united we stand, divided we fall message, which is all good stuff. And while the writing is simple, the story is incredibly tightly plotted. Considering it's an 8-book arc, every piece clicks into pace and nothing really overstays its welcome. Now, you'll see people online saying Deltora doesn't hold up as an adult, and look, I'm not gonna lie, it's written for younger readers, but if you go in with the right expectations, there's still a lot to appreciate here, even as an adult. The world building, the themes, the way everything fits together, it's just genuinely well crafted. Now, if you look at Deltora Quest sales, one thing might stand out to you. Most of its success was in Australia, which kind of makes sense when you realize that Emily Rodda, real name Jennifer Rowe, is Australian. And honestly, with how many unsettling, terrifying creatures are in these books, the land of Deltora seemingly isn't that far off from Australia itself. Now, I saw her mention in an interview in a very postmodern sentiment that a big inspiration for her was trying to engage some of these bright kids who loved but were stuck in computer games. She said, quote, "I wanted to show that you can get more fun out of a book because it's going to be your imagination," end quote. Which is great, but I do wonder if someone has told her about Dungeons and Dragons, because it does seem like a great medium between the two that also requires a good chunk of imagination. Alright, so when it comes to what actually makes up the Deltora series, book-wise, at first glance you're probably thinking, well, that's easy, it's just Deltora Quest. But like with so many things in life, it's not that simple. In fact, it's kind of far from it. The series has way more books than most people probably realize, especially when you dig beneath the surface. Let's start easy and from the top. The original Deltora Quest ran from 2000 to 2002 and was a nice, straightforward 8-book series following the gang as they collected the gem. It has a nice, clear beginning and an end all wrapped up neatly with a bow. Simple, right? Well, not exactly, because the series is far from over. Because Deltora Quest 2, which yes, literally called that, but also known as Deltora Shadowlands. Now, Rodda must have been on fire writing these, because the first book in this sequel series came out the same year as the original Deltora Quest ended. Actually, scratch that, all 3 books in Deltora Shadowlands dropped in 2002, which does make somewhat more sense when you realize that this series is significantly shorter than the first series, coming in at 3 books in total. Now, this one definitely feels like a continuation of Leaf growing up, and it leans much more into darker and more mature themes, as all good YA sequels do. Even the entire premise is pretty bleak. Even though the Shadow Lord has been driven away, he's still taken a massive number of slaves back to the Shadowland, and Leaf has this impossible choice. How is he supposed to save his people when he's the only person who can wear the belt of Deltora and protect the kingdom? If he leaves, Deltora is vulnerable. And of course, there's a bit of jealousy, misunderstanding, and a tiny bit of angst thrown in for good measure. And overall, it's a really good continuation. But we're not nearly done, because in 2004, we got Deltora Quest 3, or Dragons of Deltora. This time, Leaf is still trying desperately to pick up the pieces of Deltora after the war, but the new major threat is good old-fashioned famine, which honestly is a very underused problem in fantasy, but should be there because all these massive armies, even massive evil armies, need food, right? Okay, hopping off my soapbox. Anyway, Deltora Quest 3 again is way more mature. We're talking about torture in the first book alone, and it's clear that Rodda wanted to mature the series along with her audience. Now, it's still got the classic Deltora charm, riddles, and of course, plenty of twists and turns, and the ending was really satisfying and tied really well into the greater lore of the series. Now, you might be thinking, okay, 3 sub-series, that's not too crazy. Well, no, we are just getting started. There are actually several spin-offs set in the same universe following different characters and different events in the world. So first up, we got the Three Doors trilogy in 2011. Now this one takes place east of Deltora, set around the same time as Deltora Quest, and has a bunch of references to the main series in here, but it definitely does tell its own story. Now most people think these are pretty solid, and they do have a lot of the same charm as the OG series. Then there's the Star of Deltora, a 4-book series from 2015. Now despite the Deltora name being right there in the title, still, there actually aren't a ton of tie-ins to the main series in these books. It's generally got lower stakes than the OG Deltora Quest, but definitely still feels very Deltora-esque. Now also, this one came out with collectible cards, so if you have those, respect. But more importantly, the Star of Deltora confirmed that Rowan of Rin is canonically set in the Deltora universe. Speaking of that, Rowan of Rin really is the curveball here. Chronologically, the Rowan of Rin series actually predated all of this, releasing way back in 1993. So if we're talking about first appearances, Deltora technically showed up here first, although it wasn't mentioned by name. And while Rowan of Rin is a great series in its own right, it definitely doesn't get the same level of love as Deltora Quest. So, wrapping this all up, there are 4 distinct series set in this universe, or technically 6 if you count Deltora Quest as 3 separate ones. But if that still somehow isn't enough Deltora for you, you absolute mad lad, don't worry because there were plenty of side books released over the years. First up, the Deltora Book of Monsters from 2001, and this one is exactly what it sounds like. It's an in-universe deep dive into all the monsters and deadly creatures in Deltora, and also had some absolutely gorgeous drawings, which I'm going to be saying a lot. Then in 2006, we got Tales of Deltora, which is basically a recount of the legendary Aiden's life, complete with new illustrations, and in 2013, it got a new edition with extra stories that help connect the Three Doors trilogy. In 2009, Secrets of Deltora dropped, which is another in-universe kind of like travel guide to Deltora. And in 2011, there was The Land of Dragons, which is a collection of short stories and was actually part of Australia's Get Reading program where it was given away for free, and also the cover is just great. And if that is still not enough for you, there is still somehow way more. We've got How to Draw Deltora Monsters, How to Draw Deltora Dragons, yes, separate from the monsters, and for the ultimate Deltora fan out there, there is the Ultimate Deltora Quiz Book, which has over 1,000 questions testing your knowledge on Deltora. So seriously, if you manage to collect all of these, you get your very own virtual invisible gold star from King Aiden himself. Congratulations. Okay, so with a seemingly endless supply of books, you'd assume that Deltora Quest would have some kind of adaptation, and you, my friend, are absolutely correct. But can you guess what kind of adaptation Deltora Quest got? Movie? TV show? Graphic novel? Well, surprisingly, wrong on all counts. Instead, and seemingly out of nowhere, we got a 65-episode anime series that aired in Japan, Australia, and New Zealand in 2007. Now, it's not every day you see a Western fantasy novel adapted into an anime, although Earthsea fans, I do see you. But because apparently the series was pretty popular in Japan, Rodda actually chose this route on purpose, saying she and her kids, quote, love Japanese anime and want any adaptation of Deltora to be cool, end quote. Fair enough. Although she did apparently go back and forth with the production company about Barda's beard, because Rodda apparently really wanted Barda to have a bigger beard, which gotta love the beard love and dedication. As far as the anime itself, it kinda works. Deltora Quest fits into the anime framework surprisingly well, and I was absolutely shocked to find out that it was animated by none other than OLM, which maybe you don't know the name, but they did the iconic and unarguably best anime adaptation of Berserk in a wildly different direction from this. Anyway, the show is shockingly faithful to the books. Many conversations are straight up word for word, but don't get me wrong, it's not a perfect one-for-one. Tonally, it's much lighter compared to the books, which does kind of suck because that unsettling feeling was one of the most defining aspects of the books. Now, there are definitely other changes here too that you'll notice right from episode 1, but maybe the most jarring thing for some people is that the Gym Guardians are done with CGI, which for better or worse makes them stand out incredibly from the rest of the visuals. Now, the anime covers the first book series, the OG Deltora Quest adventure with Leaf, Barda, and Jasmine. Reviews are mixed, but if you go in expecting a lighthearted, fun adventure, you're probably going to have a good time, and at the very least, it's a fascinating genre mashup. Unfortunately, it looks like the single season is all we're ever getting since the last episode aired in 2008. But hey, if you're curious, the entire thing is available for free on YouTube, so go check it out. But in another 180, in 2007, there was a Nintendo DS game called Deltora Quest: The Seven Gems. And this one had some delicious Final Fantasy style graphics and vibes and was an RPG featuring all 3 main characters. It was also one of those DS games that were controlled by a stylus. and it even had a soundtrack by one of the composers who actually worked on Final Fantasy, which all sounds great, although maybe not the stylus. But anyway, there is a catch here. The game was never translated into English, so if anyone out there knows how to run this game in English, please let me know in the comments and I'll link it in the description. As far as other Deltora Quest games, I wasn't able to find working links, but apparently there is a gym matching game that used to be on Cartoon Network's website and a number of other Flash games on the Scholastic websites. If anyone played these back in the day, I'd love to know if they were real or just a collective hallucination, because some of them truly feel like fever dreams. Now, I did find the Scholastic Flash game link, but it wasn't actually working, so I guess the mystery remains. So, what about a live action adaptation? Has Rodda ruled it out? Well, not entirely. She said that she's going to wait until she gets an offer that is, quote, genuinely admiring of the books as they are, which totally is fair. Now, there was actually talk of a movie way back in 2011 when apparently a major Hollywood studio snapped up the rights, and then nothing. Not a single update since then. So could it still happen? Maybe. But at this point, it would be a massive surprise if Deltora Quest randomly got a movie or TV show after all this time. But then again, Percy Jackson got a decade to get a do-over, so I guess anything is possible. As far as other adaptations, there was also a Deltora Quest board game released in 2003. Basically, you would roll dice, move around the board, fight the Guardians, and collect the gems. And when all 7 gems are collected, players could take turns battling the Shadow Lord. Now, I could not get my hands on this one, so if you played it, please let me know how it is to actually play. And finally, because Japan apparently loves Deltora Quest, there was also a manga adaptation released in 2000. Now, if you're curious, you can find scans online, and much like the anime, it's actually pretty decent, and definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of the series and want to see it in a different style. Alright, so that pretty much brings us to the present. So what's going on with Deltora these days? Well, after a substantial amount of digging, I found absolutely nothing. No new books, no surprise sequels, just the occasional anniversary edition. Now, that's not to say that a revival isn't possible. The different series of Deltora played out over 15 years, so it's always possible that Rodda decides to revisit it, or that some streaming service randomly announces an adaptation out of nowhere. But as of right now, crickets. If you know something I don't, please let me know and I'll slap it in the description. Now, as far as Rodda, she's never really stopped. She's been churning out fantasy books for decades, and as of 2024, her most recent is Landlover. And say what you will about her, but she is a hard worker. I think she's written over like 100 books. Coming back to Deltora though, even without fresh content, it had a pretty solid run all in all. We got a good number of books, spin-offs, and some really well done side material. Sure, it would have been nice to have more adaptations, but at least the ones we did get were surprisingly respectful in their own way. And even if nothing ever else happens with the series, the fandom is still kicking. The subreddit is decently active, and there's a respectable amount of fan art and fan fiction floating around, which I'll link below. I even saw someone making a Deltora Quest D&D campaign, which I 100% support. After doing some digging, that someone is called Orlando C, and I'll link the project below if you want to check it out. So, tying this all together, the fact that people are still into Deltora decades later after its original release says a lot about how much the series stuck with them. So, why is that? I mean, what's the deal here? Deltora Quest first hit shelves in 2000, which, brace yourself, is officially a quarter of a century ago. And yet it's arguably been overshadowed by a lot of other series. It's still brought up plenty, while other series from the same era have just vanished. Now, obviously not everyone is going to love Deltora, and that's totally fine. But one charming thing about Deltora is that it knows exactly what it is and leans all the way into it. It's not out here trying to flip fantasy on its head or deconstruct tropes. It's classic, cozy, straightforward adventure with some dark moments thrown in. You pick up a Deltora book and you know exactly what you're getting into no matter what age you are. A trek through some weird, dangerous landscape, a few fun puzzles, and a happy ending. I was watching an interview with Rodda where she essentially said, of course the readers will grow out of her books, but in a few years they might read it again. And although the book hasn't changed, they've changed. And in that way, the book actually is very different each time you open it up. And it's kind of this magic in its own way where there's this indefinable alchemy between the reader and and the author that's constantly being renegotiated every time you open the book, which is a very interesting sentiment and one that can definitely be carried over to almost any media, especially in today's world with its seemingly endless hunger for nostalgia. And she's totally right in the way that Deltora has continued with people over the years. Whether it's the covers, the puzzles, or the cozy adventures, it's just one of those series that has stuck. So in conclusion, don't forget to never trust those evil royal advisors, and always remember to wear your belt of Deltora. Thanks so much for watching. I want to give a huge shout out to Dellet90 for helping me fact check. Also, you may have noticed that there was no sponsor for this video, but I do want to give an enormous shout out to my patrons. I really could not do this channel without you. Now, my goal for Patreon is to reach $200 per month this year so I can hire a video editor and, not pay them terribly, with the eventual aim of hopefully making this from bi-weekly video releases to a weekly thing, and having an editor would be hugely helpful with that. Anyway, if you do want to join the Patreon, there's a link below, and once you join, you can hop on the Discord, talk with me, yell at me, whatever you want to do. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment. It's always really interesting to hear what you guys have to say, and I think I covered Deltora because so many people mentioned it. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time. Bye.